Welcome to Blackbriar Gaming. Today, we'll be looking at the 15th Legion, the Thousand Suns, in the next video in our How to Build a Legion series. Hopefully, this is useful not only to those interested in the Thousand Suns, but for all Legion players, giving them an understanding of the concepts behind army building in Horus Heresy, and an idea of what each Legion can bring to the table. I hope you enjoy! A quick note before we get into it, a subscribe and a like really helps us reach a bigger audience, so if you enjoyed the video, please hit those buttons down below. Also, be sure to check out our affiliate link in the description. Thousand Suns, famous for their psykers and flouting of the Emperor's decrees. The 15th Legion are a real toolbox when it comes to army building, letting you use their Prosperine Arcana rules to provide units with relevant and powerful bonuses, at the risk, of course, of failing a psychic check and blowing their heads up. So, a toolbox that comes with a healthy dose of risk versus reward. Emphasis on the risk part. They're a Legion offering a balanced playstyle that can be tailored towards combat or shooting, depending on the whims of the player. Though I'd say they're leaning harder towards the combat side. So, let's get into it. First up is a look at the box set. The Thousand Suns are more than happy with the Heresy box set. They can do a bunch of different things with the Mark 6 Marines, and there's certainly worse options than just kitting out 40 tactical lads with the Thousand Suns' unique Asphyx bolters, and giving them the Athenian Minor Arcana upgrade for a unit that is now re-rolling to wound rolls when shooting with their bolters, which is insane, and the unit they've shot at is at -1 to the leadership for morale checks. Put these squads into a bunch of rhinos, and you have one of the better mechanized armies in the game. I would actually highly recommend rhinos and other transport for your infantry squads to avoid your sergeants, who are pivotal to your minor arcana powers, getting picked off by the plethora of snipers we're going to see in this edition. You lose your sergeants, you lose your minor arcana upgrades. Now the Asphyx Bolter Rush and all the other little tricks this army can pull off when combining its psychic powers, unique weapons, and various Legion units is what I'm talking about when I use the word toolbox here. You can do some really interesting things with units to give them specialized roles and generally lift their performance. Sticking on the Thousand Suns' unique weapon theme, I'd highly recommend giving 10 of your beakies the Either Fire Blasters. I don't really know how to pronounce that word. I'm not even going to try. 18-inch Assault 2 weapons that, while only rending on a 6+, are potentially doing so at strength 8 if you pass your psychic check, which is that sweet spot for instant death, it's just becoming so important in this edition. These weapons are really nice. I'm really into them. Check them out. Any kind of plasma-ish weapon that gets rid of Gets Hot is a tick in my box, and something I actually want to be putting on Marines with the 3+ save. Now, the 10 Cataphracti Terminators that you get in the box set certainly have a place in numerous Thousand Suns armies, though they do unfortunately compete with the amazing-looking Sekhmet Terminator Cabal, the 15th's unique Terminator unit, just because the models, they're just so good. Now, to differentiate the unit, because I want to include both, obviously, I'd always be arming your regular Cataphracti with Power Fists and Chain Fists. The various Minor Arcana are fantastic for Cataphracti Terminators, and how I deploy them would dictate which one I'd choose. If they're going to deep strike with one of the Thousand Suns' ridiculous Rites of War, and more on that later, I'd give them the Pyre Minor Arcana for a bunch of Hammer of Wrath attacks when they charge in. If they're going to ride in a transport or leg it up the table, the 3+ movement they get from the Pavoni Minor Arcana is really handy for these traditionally slower boys. Now, I don't love the Spartan for Thousand Suns. It's a big chunk of points to not be spending on infantry, which is where the Thousand Suns' power really lies. With all of their psychic shenanigans they can do, you really want your infantry and cavalry shining through in this army, and the Spartan, it's a bit of a miss. But look, if you're not running that deep strike orientated Rite of War that I keep teasing, having a way to get a big combat unit reliably up the table unscathed is always useful. And furthermore, if you're using a Spartan for another unit, let's say a big unit of Despoilers, really handy for protecting that Sergeant. With all the precision shots we're seeing in the game right now, Thousand Suns could really use a strong transport like the Spartan to get up the table. So it just depends on what other units you're taking and which Rite of War you're choosing. Now, the Dreadnought in the box set is useful for almost every Legion, and the Thousand Suns are no exception. Just for flavor and to save a whole lot of money, I'd be tempted to convert the box set Contemptor into a Contemptor Osiren Dreadnought, which is one of the Thousand Suns' unique units. Think a Contempted Dreadnought, but it can cast psychic powers. Either a minor arcana at only 15 extra points, or a full-blown psychic discipline for 50 points. The latter option seems a bit pricey, so I'd probably stick with the rather uninspiring but solid option of giving your Osiren the Raptora minor arcana and upgrading its invulnerable save to a 4+, which you can't do with a regular Dreadnought, because a regular Dreadnought can't take a minor arcana. That 4+ is as long as you're within 12 inches of your opponent, so keep this thing out for close combat. Now, the Praetors aren't great picks for the Thousand Suns, though I'm sure they can be converted up to represent various consoles you might choose to run. Good example is a Praevian. If you want to run a bunch of Psychic Castellax, then you need a Praevian, and one of these boys I'm sure could step in and fill the job. Personally, I'm a huge fan of the Thousand Suns characters, especially Magistus, there we go, Aemon. He's so good. So there'll be limited space for subsequent HQs, and I don't think the Praetors from the box set are going to get a lot of use. Now, overall, the box set is very usable for Thousand Suns, and if the Spartan doesn't fit into your plans, you can always sell it off, so I'd pick one up. Let's now have a look at the 15th Legion's special rules and what that means for army building. Now, I've actually been describing their Legion special rules kind of as I go. They essentially revolve around the minor arcana upgrades and giving a psychic discipline to any one of your independent characters. For a cost, of course. So, going into it, it's called Cult Arcana. Essentially, infantry or cavalry units, for free, can select one of the minor arcana options. Now, if they're independent characters for plus 15 points, they get to choose a psychic discipline, and that's about it, right? Now, the depth comes from the minor arcana. We'll get into each of those in a minute. I'm going to structure the conversation that way because that seems a good way to do it. Now, the minor arcana upgrades are quite subtle in their nature, and they do need a bit of work to get off. They also won't be particularly useful for all units. Right from the start, it's clear that Thousand Suns want to be focusing on infantry and cavalry. For that infantry, putting them in transport's not the worst idea in the world, but other vehicles and non-Osiren dreadnoughts need to be doing something pretty impressive to warrant inclusion and miss out on the free psychic shenanigans their foot slogging or bike riding counterparts can access. So let's chat about each of those minor arcana and which units benefit most. Starting up, Raptora. Now, Raptora, essentially, if you move with a unit within 12 inches of an enemy unit, you get to get +1 to your invulnerable save. Now, if you don't have an invulnerable save, that's 6+. If you have an invulnerable save of 5+ already, that's going to 4+. Unfortunately, it can't make a 4+ invul into a 3+. It maxes out at that 4+ step. So Cataphracti, unfortunately, cannot benefit from this one. Bit of a shame, but it is what it is. Now, I think this upgrade works best on your combat-focused squads that you've tasked with taking out the specialist combat-centric enemy units, so such as enemy Terminators, enemy Legion units with bulk power weapons, or enemy Dreadnoughts. This is also handy for charging into units packing ranged weapons that can get through your regular armor saves and are ready to just unleash them in a pesky Overwatch reaction. Tartarus Terminators are the obvious pick here, as they benefit really nicely from going to a 4+ invul save, and you actually want them going up against those units that commonly have weapons that'll get through your regular armor saves, giving them Power Fist, Thunder Hammers, whatever it is. So Tartarus Terminators are my pick for the Raptora here, and I'd really want to include some of the Thousand Suns army. Now, looking at the next minor arcana, we've got the Pyre upgrade. So when a charge is declared for a unit that includes a psyker with this power, you get Hammer of Wrath 2 special rule. And it counts as flame attacks. Now, I don't know what that flame attack, that might be useful against other certain opponents. I don't know if we've seen any yet where it has an impact, but I'm sure it will eventually. So Hammer of Wrath 2, really good, right? Now, this upgrade is best used on units that will be charging into combats, but that don't already have the Hammer of Wrath upgrade, which is quite a few of them. All units with jump packs, for instance, already have Hammer of Wrath 1, so you're missing out on kind of 50% of the bonus here. Yes, going up to Hammer of Wrath 2 is certainly better than nothing, but I really want to be putting this on units that don't have Hammer of Wrath at all. Now, a good example is that big Despoiler squad, which I mentioned before, coming out of your Spartan or a separate Land Raider, or Cataphracted Terminators assaulting out a Deep Strike are a great one to have the Pyre upgrade on as well. Keep waiting for that Rite of War, for that Deep Strike chats. It's coming. Now, next up, we have the Pavoni Minor Arcana upgrade. It's +3 movement during the movement phase, notably not affecting your charging distance, so keep that in mind, but +3 movement is fantastic. This is great for any unit with line that needs to be moving around to capture objectives. It's great for units with short-ranged firepower that need to be able to move around damage to do move around the table to make sure they're doing damage. It's great for any assault-based unit that isn't deep striking or being transported into battle, and even if they are being transported into battle, that +3 movement still makes a difference on the turn you hop out. Tactical squads, tactical support squads, assault squads deployed on the table, Terminators slugging up the battlefield, destroyers. It's a big list of units that will be taking this Minor Arcana, and I think it's going to be one of the more popular ones. It's one of the least sexy ones, I guess, but I think it's going to be a very solid one to take, and you're going to be wanting to use it in multiple turns. Noting that, of course, every turn that you do use it, you risk your heads exploding from perils of the warp. So that's something to consider as well. Now, next up, we get into kind of the shooty powers, if you will. The first one is the Corvidae upgrade. Now, that essentially allows you to get a sneaky precision shot on that first wound. I'm not entirely positive on how this mechanic works. I assume it's allocating the wound after failed armor saves, maybe. And that if you wanted this to be put against a sergeant wearing artificer armor, your opponent would need to roll against their armor save at your discretion until they fail one? Or is it if they roll the first armor save and pass it, you don't get it anymore? So you really want to be using it on weapons with decent AP. It's a bit confusing. Someone please correct me in the comments on how exactly this works in the simplest way they can, because my mind's just gone all over the place with this one. Now, it's a bit tricky to use, but it certainly has the potential to be super useful depending on how that mechanic works if we work it out. Now, as the rule only works for the first wound, there are so many units against which this Arcana just isn't that useful. I suppose the key is to have this on multiple units, allowing you to take out 2-wound characters, such as elite infantry sergeants or non-terminated consuls, apothecaries, within a single phase. That's a sweet spot. Taking out sergeants is kind of great, I guess, especially if your opponent is also a Thousand Suns player, but I'd much rather be able to pick off apothecaries if I'm going to be, doing psychic shenanigans to try and do something with precision shots. So I'd be taking this on heavy support squads where they can work in combination with each other, as units with longer range weapons have that greater ability to work together and get range on the same enemy unit. Or, hear me out here, we just make sure we put the Corvidae Minor Arcana upgrade on units that are going to be causing instant death. Here we go. So las cannons are the obvious choice here, and I wouldn't really bother with any other options in this case if we're trying to do those 2 wounds with that instant death. The las cannons let us snipe out characters to our heart's content. Now, while using anti-armor weapons on infantry just to pull this off might not be worthwhile, I think a small 5-man unit with sniper las cannons doesn't sound like the worst idea in the world. It sounds pretty sweet. This also works really nicely on jet bikes or land speeder squadrons with multi-melters for taking out characters when no vehicle presents themselves as targets. Instant death. It's gonna be spicy. It also gives you a pretty good reason to put a plasma pistol on your sergeants within your tactical squads if you choose to take this power. Though be aware that if you lose your sergeant, you're losing your Minor Arcana upgrade. It's this risk versus reward, right? So putting a plasma pistol on a sergeant, just another risk that you're taking. All right, now the final power I want to talk about that exists, so of course I have to talk about it, is the Athenaean. Yep, that sounds about right. Minor Arcana power. So many strange words in this army. Now, this is my go-to for most shooting units, especially those that have pinning weapons, as you're causing both pinning and leadership checks in the same shooting phase at the -1 leadership that this power puts onto the enemy unit that you're shooting at. So that's great. Now, the leadership check has to be as long as you kill 25% of the unit. The pinning has to be as long as you do a wound. But if you're ticking both those boxes, they're now making a pinning check and a leadership check at -1 to their leadership. I should say morale check in that first case, not leadership check. These words are important. So who do you want to give this to? Tactical support squads with rotor cannons are really great because they have pinning. Recon squads with nemesis bolters. Not only are they one of the better units in the game, but now your opponent is taking -1 on their morale checks and their pinning checks. So good. Heavy support squads with missile launchers firing frag rounds can start to do some wounds and some pinning. All great choices. Essentially, I think this will be really popular, and it synergizes really nicely with one of the Rites of War, that spicy one I keep talking about. We're getting there. We're almost there. So, something to consider though. You really want to be taking bigger squads within a Thousand Suns army when you're taking those minor Arcana upgrades, as you're inevitably going to suffer multiple perils of the warp throughout your game. So you need to have those bigger squads of infantry to soak up those wounds. Just something to think about when you're building your army and collecting your force. So, there was lots to talk about there, complex rules, lots going on with the Thousand Suns. But with that covered, let's finally take a look at these Rites of War. The Thousand Suns have two very different looking Rites of War. They've got the Arcane, there we go, Arcane configuration, and the Guard of the Crimson King. We'll kick off with the Guard of the Crimson King first, as I've already alluded to it multiple times, and I think it's just so spicy. So the effects here are, the controlling player may designate up to 6 units from a detachment using this Rite of War that are made up entirely of models with the infantry unit type. These units gain the Deep Strike special rule. When these units are deployed as part of a Deep Strike assault, they gain the Fear 1 special rule for the duration of the turn in which they are deployed to the battlefield for the whole turn, so it's going to be having multiple impacts there. Now, Sekhmet Cabals may be selected as troop choices for this detachment. When it comes to limitations, you must include either Magnus the Red, Araman, or a Legion Praetor, Legion Cataphracto Praetor, or Legion Tartarus Praetor, upgraded to have the Psychic Discipline. Now, you're going to do that every single time, almost, anyway, unless I'm taking my Magis's Amon, but I'm not taking him in this list. The Rite of War also may not be used as an allied detachment, so pretty much no downsides, and being able to deep strike 6 infantry units is just so powerful in this edition. Okay, it's huge. The real power move here is selecting combat-focused units and having them charge into combat on the turn they deep strike in, which of course you can't do with drop pod armies. Though there's certainly nothing wrong with bringing a few short-ranged but powerful shooting units. I probably want to bring tactical support squads with melter guns or either fire blasters to soften up targets or pop transports on the turn you arrive. But there's some other good options, and I'll get into them a little later. Causing fear and reducing the leadership of nearby enemy units works so nicely with the dip striking pinning mechanic, and it should be noted, stacks with the Athenaean Minor Arcana that we talked about before. This is putting enemy units at -2 leadership for potential pinning from your Athenaean shooting squads, which will hopefully, noting, of course, those squads that you're shooting at have to be within 12 of your deep striking units, which are causing the fear, which will hopefully stop them from being able to react with an overwatch, so your deep striking combat units can charge in. The synergy is really nice here, and it's a real hallmark of the Thousand Suns. We're coming back to that toolbox piece that I was talking about before. Lastly, being able to take Sekhmet Cabal as troops, that's the Thousand Sun Legion's Terminators, and they can take a core Psychic Discipline, and geez, there's some good Psychic Disciplines out there. So I really want to give these Psychic Terminators telepathy for even more pinning shenanigans. You're just at this point starting to really shut down significant parts of your enemy's army. If you haven't read up on the telepathy psychic power, please do so. It is obscene, and it's just so good. Where reactions are such a huge part of this game, having a psychic power that can pin multiple units in a turn is outrageous. Now, this is a tactic that seems kind of rude, but it also really appeals to me. I'm not particularly a nice person, and this may be why. Strongly recommend it. This thing is all about deep striking in, charging into combat, pinning your opponent's army. It's great. I love everything it's doing. So there's a lot of interesting army build options for this Rite of War. A bunch of stuff I've already mentioned. So this Rite of War is so powerful and has a really unique feel to it. It creates multiple synergies to pin your own opponent in place, tear their army apart. I think a mix between combat units and short-range firepower units is the sweet spot here. Trying to deep strike 6 combat units and get them all into assault in the one turn may be a bit tricky, especially depending on how your opponent deploys to try and stop you doing that, I dare say. So I'd mix it up a bit. I'd also want some long-range units in this army with pinning weapons, so recons with Nemesis Bolters are the obvious choice. Now, for the combat units that are deep striking in, I'd be tempted to take at least one big but cheap unit of Despoilers, just to get a whole bunch of bodies on the ground with the line subtype in your kind of enemy zone of control. Next up, I'm always going to want to take at least one decent unit of Sekhmet Terminators, which, as I mentioned before, would want to take the Telepathy Psychic Discipline. We want 2 more combat units to really drive this theme home, so I think a unit of Thousand Suns, Kenetai, Occult Cabal seem like a fun inclusion, if not particularly powerful, but let's get the flavor in there, right? So let's take one of those. And finally, a really big unit of Tartarus Terminators, or even better, actually, Indomitus Terminators, which we saw in that Legacies document come out recently, for access, cheap access to Power Fists and Chain Fists to deal with enemy Dreadnoughts, but that can still benefit from that Raptora Minor Arcana. That leaves 2 spots open of our 6 infantry that we're deep striking in. So tactical support squads that I mentioned with either melter guns or the either fire blasters do great work here. Breaches could also be fun, especially if there's more objectives on your opponent's side of the table that need to be secured by a hardy unit that can still put down some close range firepower. Essentially, pick what you like. A Mortalis Destroyer squad is also a great choice and can be kitted out to perform some niche roles that your other squads maybe can't quite pull off. Another good idea is veteran squads with their 2 wounds. Kit them out with a bunch of special shooting weapons, and they're pretty tasty as well. Now, to lead your deep striking contingent, Magnus is the obvious choice here and the one I'd be looking at first, as he comes organically with deep strike, so won't take up one of your 6 slots. But if you don't have the points, or you're playing a smaller game, Aramin is the next best thing, and will end up costing you kind of about the same points as a Praetor with the Psychic Discipline upgrade anyway. To support your deep striking contingent, I really like a couple of Legion reconnaissance squads to hold home objectives. They have line, they're amazing, they're really hard to reach with their shroud bombs, and they contribute to your pinning shenanigans with Nemesis bolter rifles. You could also double down on the deep striking theme with some assault squads, but having some decent boots on the ground prior to your reserves turning up is super important, so to make sure you're not getting tabled. So I think the reconnaissance squads are the better way to go here. So that is the Guard of the Crimson King Rite of War. Now, if you'd rather rampage across the table with a horde of psychic robots, then you're going to want to check out the Archaean configuration. The idea here is that this detachment can select Castellax Archaea Automata units as non-compulsory troop choices. Any model with it detached from this detachment using this Rite of War that is within 12 of your Castellax and suffers the Peril of the Warp may choose to allocate all the wounds inflicted by that Perils of the Warp to the Castellax. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Now, lastly, a Castellax Archaea model in a detachment using this Rite of War is considered to have the line subtype. Very good. As long as that model is within 6 inches of a friendly model with both the Legiones Astartes special rule and the Psyker subtype. Cool. Limitations here. Any Castellax Archaea Automata units selected as troop choices must include more than one model, which, look, they're expensive, but sure. A detachment using this Rite of War must include at least one Legion Tech Marine Covenant, okay? And a detachment using this Rite of War must include at least one model from the, with the Legiones Consularis special rule that has selected the Legion Praevian upgrade. So lots of requirements there. Now, what are the pros? You have a bunch of Castellax as troops. Great. Frees up your elite slots and gives you a bunch of killy robots in your troop slots. But honestly, I don't think these Castellax are fantastic. They're going to really struggle against enemy Dreadnoughts and even Terminators in close combat. With that weapon skill of 3, they're hidden a bit, they're a bit limp in close combat. And honestly, their firepower isn't that great either because it's only got a AP of 4 and it's only rending on 6+. These guys don't overly inspire me. I think it's a lot of points for something that feels like it's going to fall a little flat. Now, on the upside though, the miniatures look fantastic. So that's something. This is pros and cons, by the way. I'm going back and forth here. So the ability to suffer the Perils of Warp on these guys instead of your multitude of psykers is kind of a two-edged sword, as your Castellax are often going to be more expensive than the unit suffering the Perils of the Warp. We're talking about 140 points a model, right? They're not cheap, and they've only got 4 wounds. But I'd definitely be using this ability if something like my Osiran Dreadnought, for instance, was going to explode itself with Power of the Warp. So gaining line is handy back into pros, so giving this unit line is great, though you've got to have someone within 6 inches with the psychic power, so it's got to be an infantry unit, perhaps, or a cavalry unit with their sergeant still alive, I might add. But using these as objective holders, I'm not sure I want to do that either. They only have a 3+ save, so they don't have great staying power. And I certainly wouldn't want to keep them on my backfield holding objectives. I want them up in the opponent's face. So I'm not that excited about them getting line. And some missions it'll be better than others, I suppose. But you do need a unit to babysit them as well. They're an expensive unit to have another unit to babysit them, noting that unit could have line anyway. So it's a bit I'm seeing a lot of meh coming through. The extra tax of having to take a Techmarine Covenant and a Praevian Consul just starts to add up to this Rite of War not giving me an overly warm and fuzzy feeling. But, saying that, it's a lot of fun, and I think it's going to look really cool, because as I said, these models are just beautiful. So let's take a look at how we build out this army. Now, your warp-powered Castellax have a few natural enemies out there. Predominantly anything armed with missile launchers, which can often be taken en masse, and the ubiquitous Dreadnought. So we want to deal with these. So we want to build the army around dealing with these issues that our Castellax are going to have. Firstly, dealing with the missile launchers. Most commonly found in bulk within heavy support squads. Well, all those pinning shenanigans that I talked about before are a really good starting point for dealing with infantry units that will otherwise be bunkered down in the backfield of our opponent's deployment zone. If you're going to include a few units of recon marines or scouts to take care of these with Nemesis bolters, it might also be worth looking at Magistus Amon, who has Master of the Legion, which is handy, and I personally think he's just the absolute bee's knees. He is such a cool character. Read up on him. He's amazing. I'd want to give him a beefed up Seeker squad to infiltrate with and keep our reconnaissance and scout squads back in our deployment zone, pinning enemy units with their 72-inch Nemesis bolters. So that's dealing with missile launcher squads. Just pin them right down with our Athenaean Minor Arcana, giving them -1 leadership. Now, when it comes to dealing with Dreadnoughts, there's nothing better than another Dreadnought. The Brutal 3 on their Grevas Power Fist makes all the difference here, and you can happily trade your Dreadnoughts with your opponent, while your Castellax are freed up to prey on weaker enemy infantry. This almost kind of becomes a weirdly psychically fueled mix between Fury of the Ancients and an Iron Brethren list, but with a whole bunch more flavor. And I think it's kind of definitely better than an Iron Brethren list, because you get psychic shenanigans in there, and it kind of looks cooler. Now, other things I want to include in this list, for the mandatory Techmarine and Praevian characters that we have to take, I'm going to give that Techmarine a Cognis Signum and probably chuck him in one of my reconnaissance squads and leave him to it. That boosts your ballistic skill by 1 for those that aren't aware, which is kind of nice. Now, the Praevian, whose special rules are almost useless, I should note, with the Castellax, aka having the rules they do. But I'd chuck it in a unit with one of the Castellax, maybe give it a Power Fist to help out our robots in case they do find themselves in combat with something a little tougher than them. Once you've taken a couple of decent units of Castellax, noting they can be taken in units of up to 5, and some other troops to fill out your mandatory slots and open up some more line options, you're kind of starting to hit your points limit, so we're at the kind of end of this army build. But if you do have any points left, some units of Tartarus Terminators to support our Castellax and keep up with them certainly wouldn't go astray. Or maybe some long-range firepower from Whirlwinds or Rapier batteries, which I tried for the first time last week, and they're fantastic. Just to soften up those nasty targets before we charge in, and contribute to that pinning we mentioned earlier. So that is the 2000 Suns Rite of War. We've got the Guard of the Crimson King, which is so powerful, maybe one of the more powerful in the game, and the Archaean configuration, which I think falls a little limp, but it comes down to your personal preference and what you like to run. Now, I've discussed the Thousand Suns characters as we've gone through this, so I'm not going to go into any further depth, and we're also pushing it for time. Needless to say, all 3 are very solid choices, and I think they'll find their way into most armies. Saying that, the Thousand Suns Warlord Traits are also really nice. So some people might be tempted to take a regular old Praetor just to try them out, noting that your Praetor can get that Psychic Discipline for only 15 points, which is super spicy, really nice there. All in all, the Thousand Suns have so much potential and are a really interesting army to build, with a ton of decision points and interesting choices. That will bring us to the end of our Legion build chats for Thousand Suns. Thank you so much for watching. How are you planning to build your 15th Legion army? Are you going to go with the Legion Rites of War or another direction entirely? Let us know in the comments below. Importantly, make sure to keep rolling those dice and getting hyped for Heresy.